Sure. My name is Greg Guibert. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boulder. It's a position that's grant funded by the Rockefeller Foundation as part of the Global 100 Resilient Cities project. So I'm a city employee, but funded through the Rockefeller Foundation.
And was this all something that happened since the flood in 2013?
Yeah, the flood, in fact, occurred just at the deadline for the application. So it was already in the works. I was obviously not involved. I was not a city employee at the time, but it wasn't the precipitating event to apply for.
And what is your background before coming to this position?
Sure. My background actually is I was the manager of the Natural Hazard Center for a number of years, and then after that I worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, building resilience in cities in Southeast Asia.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's actually a program that was a precursor to the 100 Resilient Cities called the ACERN program, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, which is a bit of a mouthful. It was 10 cities in 4 countries around Southeast Asia.
Wow, fantastic. And so have the things from those cities that in Southeast Asia been able to apply to translate over to Boulder, Colorado?
You know, it's interesting. There are, every city likes to think that it's unique, and it really makes sort of trans-urban planning a little bit challenging. But in this particular case, yeah, there are some challenges, of course. Everybody's struggling with climate change in particular. The manifestations of that are very different across the board, but how do you mobilize this in action? How do you plan for an uncertain future? How do you use the information that we have available to us to support decisions without complicating things even further?
And can you answer those questions?
Not at all. No, I mean, I say that in a flip sort of way, but it's really it's about creating capacity within the community to adapt in real time. They have to have those connections. They have to have those networks. They have to have some baseline knowledge, but it's going to be different in every community and even different parts of those communities.
And with Boulder, it's a community that has a pretty substantial amount of wealth and knowledge, and it probably has an underserved population as well, unless they've migrated somewhere else.
Well, we do have an underserved population. It differentiates across different demographics and socioeconomic criteria. Of course, we have a university, so we have a fair number of students who aren't necessarily terribly responsive to risk messaging or particularly aware of risk response behavior. So that is a challenge, and whether they are wealthy or sort of student poor, it's a very specific type of demographic. And then Boulder does have a reputation for being a wealthy community, but we do have people well below the poverty line who live within the city limits. As a city, we don't, I would say, do a lot of work in Spanish, and that's a real issue as well.
So, as a city employee, who are your partners in crime, in a sense, in the work you're doing? Is it the university? Who do you call upon for help and resource?
Well, for the resilience work, what we've really tried to do is tap into existing networks. I mean, we had the 2013 flood. This comes after 2 years of wildfire prior to that. So people were really fired up, not ironically, to deal with disasters and risk reduction activities. So there were already existing groups. So for instance, in the county, there's an organization called BOCO Strong, Boulder County Strong. Their geographic sphere of influence is larger than just the city. And so we've done a lot of work just trying to blur that line, that municipal boundary, to the extent that actually they received a grant that I helped with to help support my position. So I'm a city employee who's going to be receiving support from a staff member from the county, which is a really unique sort of arrangement.
Awesome. Yeah. You have some questions?
What kind of lessons have you learned to incentivize mitigation?
In Boulder, at some level, we don't need a whole lot of incentive. I mean, these are really salient issues. People are really thinking quite strongly about them right now. Even though we had this flooding event, most of the flooding was from basements, actually from groundwater. And what we discovered was that while most places do have sump pumps, most of them had been clogged or disconnected. And so we're doing a program now to incentivize people to, so it's an educational campaign, but then there will be a financial incentive to install sump pumps. Aside from that, there's really not much the city can do about groundwater intrusion. So that's really our primary focus for that hazard.
And what about some smart vents, some vents that will allow water to flow back out.
Yeah, we're looking at a whole bunch of different measures. It's a new hazard for the city. We don't have a good map for it. Even in this past May with all the rain, it was almost a perfect repeat. Same basements flooding.
And it's also when you have a 1,000-year event, is that going to be the crisis or is it another 100 years or?
Yeah, so the 1,000-year event thing gets thrown around a lot. In Boulder, it was absolutely not a 1,000-year event. It wasn't even a 1,000-year rainfall event. It was the way that it's set up really tracked differently as you went north. So we were spared a fair amount of the devastation, despite all of our progressive land use planning. So it's a little tricky to say a 1,000-year event. And in fact, this wasn't a flash flood technically, but in flash flooding, in this topography, those designations, those return periods really don't mean a whole lot.
Greg, what does resiliency mean to you, and how can agencies such as FEMA or any other federal agencies help you to have your community become more resilient?
Yeah, so what it means to me it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of different definitions. I think we're kind of narrowing in on a few. I like the Rockefeller Foundation's definition with a few modifications. But I think what's really great about resilience as a concept is that inherently I think people get it. Even if they can't put those feelings into words, they feel resilient. Most people do. It gets a little bit more challenging when you talk about systems and scaling it up. But I think people get the concept, and so it's a comfortable one for most people.
Are you thinking they get the concept more so than hazard mitigation?
I do, yeah. I think they do. Because personal resilience transcends risk activity, risk awareness or avoidance activities. It's about your health. It's about your economic resilience. People conceive of it in a much more holistic way, which is why I think it is a great lens for talking about disaster risk reduction activities and mitigation.
Can you comment on the overall picture, if you will, of natural hazard mitigation and resiliency with so many big storms, Hurricane Sandy, things like that, and what it would take for us to do a whole paradigm shift to make a shift to doing more before the disaster, to the dollars saved with pre-mitigation versus post-mitigation. What will that take? Do you have any recommendations or comments?
I don't know that I have a great sense of what it's going to take. I think one of the things that's really exciting about the Rockefeller program in particular is the very holistic way of looking at resilience. And so it starts to blur or erase those boundaries from disaster to normal blue sky days, right? You want to be resilient on a blue sky day as much as you want on a disaster. And when you take a look at disasters from drought to economic downturns to the whole spectrum, you start looking more about behavior and just sort of everyday activity rather than you need to be prepared for a high consequence, low probability event, which is really hard. I mean, that's the messaging around that is difficult. So when you start thinking about it in a different way, I think that's the phase change we're looking at.
And what are your mechanisms of messaging?
We're exploring that. I think this is where the rubber hits the road, right? I mean, this is really applied resilience, and in Boulder, we've been very fortunate in some respects to have had a couple of non-catastrophic events that help with the messaging, right? But we don't want it to be about exclusively disaster issues. We're also dealing with a housing affordability crisis, which is not the same thing as affordable housing, which would be for lower income, but just the affordability. And the repercussions of our progressive land use planning with the Greenbelt now is coming home to roost a little bit. And so people are open to some new thinking. I think that's sort of beyond the sustainability lens in terms of resource conservation. But we've seen a couple of events. We've seen the problems that the Greenbelt can impose. Not that we shouldn't have that. I mean, they can be coexisting.
Talk about what the problems are, what the repercussions are.
Yeah, certainly. So Boulder is now fairly unaffordable for the vast majority of Americans, and in particular first responders. I don't know of any professional first responder who lives within the boundaries of Boulder. And then you couple that with a greenbelt that creates real trouble for mutual aid or just response times. And that's just a really fundamental problem. Then a second tier issue is that we now have only one hospital facility in the city for 100,000 people, and it's in the floodplain. And so the city doesn't like to talk about that, of course. They like to say that, well, we have just as many emergency beds as we did 2 years ago when we had 2 hospitals. That's great, but they're all in the floodplain now. And that's not an issue that's been addressed yet.
Is it in your mitigation plan to address those?
It's a brand new development. It's only happened in the last 6 months. People are only slightly putting their mind around it now.
Did it get flooded in 2013?
They did not close. They were fine in 2013. But again, the flood in 2013 on Boulder Creek was only a 25-year event. In terms of flood stage, there were a couple of smaller waterways within the city that activated at a closer to a 100-year event. But the 1,000-year event, the really big devastation, that was in watersheds further north in the county, and they're still obviously very much in recovery mode from those.
And fire is also in your radar as being a potential devastating.
Yeah, and in some ways it's far, far worse. It is a generational change of the landscape. And in Boulder, it's hard to know where to start. Is it climate change? Is it invasive species? Is it drought that allows for the pests to come in? It's a really interesting and difficult knot. And then you can even really look at it from the social end of things, right? So we have a pretty substantial transient population that in the summer likes to camp. I mean, it's safe for them. It's in the woods. But they're also not really well tuned to risk messaging, so there's a huge fire risk associated with that. So I think wildfire, without question, is our biggest near-term threat.
And it's coming from probably outside of the city, but the city is the first entity that's going to be affected by it.
It is. I mean, so Boulder's weird in the sense that we have really rich urban core and a very hard boundary around it. But the city municipality includes open space and mountain parks, so that is managed land. And we've had 2 major wildfires on it in the last 5 years.
And have you been able to use the green belt as a fire buffer? I mean, in some senses, it's like a great fire lane.
It is, although it's not particularly on the west end.
Yeah,
I mean, the
right.
woods come right up. I mean, I live on 2nd Street, and it's like it's right there. That's the trailhead.
How will the chief resilience officers, if you could comment on the Rockefeller Foundations, how do they continue their work once they're unfunded? Is the city building that into their plan?
Well, obviously, I can only speak for Boulder, but yeah, I mean that's the real challenge, and presumably part of the resilience strategy, which is the deliverable for the grant, is the sustainability of the effort. And I don't mean that in the natural resource sense, but actually the financial stability and incorporation into the functions of government. And to be honest, like I don't know that Boulder is going to make that long-term investment in the position, but to that end, the sort of short of it is that our strategy is to incorporate the principles of resilience and resilient design at sort of the tip of the spear, from our sustainability framework and an integration of resilience principles there into the comprehensive plan and into the master planning process. So whether there's a feeling that there needs to be an office of resilience that's comparable to the office of sustainability is still a conversation to be had. 2 years is the blink of an eye in terms of some of this planning stuff, so we're pushing hard on those important inflection points.
How does the organization of Boulder work as far as emergency managers and planners coordinating together?
Well, a big lesson learned from the last couple of events. A lot more coordination. We have a long-term flood recovery coordinator. There's one in the county as well. They work very closely with OEM in this post-event assessment. There are a series of recommendations that are starting to fall out about how we can coordinate better. Most of the city staff has sort of a secondary function now assigned for during periods of disaster. There's not that big a community, so it's important to know what your secondary function is. So there are things like that are starting to happen. It wasn't that Boulder was unprepared. Certainly, we weathered it better than many of the local communities or neighboring communities, but we are learning some important lessons.
So since it's a new position, and it's a new position for the city of Boulder, do you have peers within the city government that are responsive to your insights?
Yeah, it's an uneven uptake on the concepts of resilience, certainly, and that you wouldn't expect it any other way. But I do have a resilience team, like a staff team of operational kind of directors, who are really excited about this this program and the resources that are being brought to bear and a new way of thinking. So that's been pretty tremendous. It's just now starting to bear some fruit. I mean, we spent the first 6 or 9 months, probably longer than we would have otherwise, since I'm new to the government, just doing our assessment, what we call a preliminary resilience assessment. So we've identified a couple of gaps and things that we want to, gaps in our understanding, gaps in our capacity that we want to address. And through that process, we've really started to stitch together this team that's across really most of the operational units in the city.
Awesome. And can you list those operational units kind of in?
Well, we have everybody from a representative from the city manager's office, comprehensive planning, sustainability, fire rescue, police, communications, utilities, of course. So some of the obvious ones, food security, which is an interesting piece. It's mainly about local foods right now. But yeah, just it's the full range, really. Health and Human Services.
And how would you differentiate between resiliency and sustainability?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the illustrative example there is planting street trees is a sustainable sort of thing, but a resilience lens on that would be to plant different species. So it's differentiated. It's not like all your eggs in one basket.
Right. So it's another level of sustainability in a sense.
It could be. But so one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting when we try and merge these two concepts and the frameworks that exist, and whether we use Rockefeller's framework or the state's new framework, we have an existing sustainability framework which is embedded in all of the city operations and budgeting priorities. And so we want to graft some of the resilient stuff on, co-equal. And in some areas, it's possible that the value systems are at odds, right? So in sustainability, efficiency is a primary principle. In resilience, robustness and redundancy is, which would be potentially inefficient. It kind of depends on your lens. It kind of depends on what you're talking about. But I think it'll be interesting to interrogate those.
And the timeline.
And the timeline, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any unique models of incentives as far as rebate programs or working with solar energy or green energy that would tie into the natural hazards resiliency work?
The city has a series of very progressive, some would say aggressive, rebate and incentive programs around renewable energy. One of our ongoing efforts, it's really ramping up right now, is an effort to municipalize our energy system. Right now, a private company runs a generation facility that's that uses coal as its primary source of energy. And so for a city that has carbon reduction goals of 80% by 2050, it's a full-scale transition to renewable distributed energy. And so taking that, which is being done under a climate commitment, and applying resilience design principles is another way that we're just going to really embed resilience into the fabric of the city. And that's going to happen very, very quickly. Those transitions will begin soon. And I think what we're looking at is probably to begin with like a nodal structure that's going to be based on a risk landscape. We saw sort of the fracture of the city based on watersheds and during the last flood, and sort of using that as an overlay and understanding where these nodes of generation and storage need to be based on risk will be really interesting.
Yeah, and then could the green space be used for solar fields?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because
that against the principle of the green space.
Yeah, we're doing a solar capacity study, and it seems like just using roofs alone will be well over our needed capacity for the foreseeable future. But it's not impossible to imagine that, for instance, we would. Most of the green space is actually in active, productive landscape. Whether it's cattle or local foods, but using some of the biomass to produce natural gas could be an interesting.
And you could potentially export your energy as a city to neighboring communities.
It's entirely possible, yeah.
Is there anything that you're doing as a resiliency officer that addresses those populations and those issues?
Well, the housing affordability issue or affordable housing, again, slightly different issues, is not one that has been an easy nut to crack right now. It's a highly charged political environment around growth and affordability, and so by choice in the sort of this near term period, have chosen to sort of not look at some of those issues. The vulnerable populations issue is a very different one, and separated from the housing affordability issue is one that we are looking at. The Human Services Master Plan is being updated this year, and they're actually reorienting the entire plan to be about personal resilience and resilience to those communities. So that's pretty exciting.
What does that mean? How do they get that message out? I'm just curious how.
Well, they're just ramping it up right now, so we're actually designing what that should look like now. And I made some comment earlier about how we don't do a lot of outreach in Spanish, and those are some of the populations that are at most risk in Boulder. But through the Human Services Master Planning process and this stakeholder engagements that's going on with that, a lot of it will be done in Spanish. So it's kind of piggybacking onto an existing effort planning process that's already underway.
Is what Natural Hazards Mitigation Association, what we're attempting to do with the Disaster Risk Reduction Curriculum and Ambassador Program, do you see that as something that citizens in your community or elected officials would be interested in?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The program that's being proposed, I think, is really exciting. And one of the projects that we're going to be exploring in the city has some really direct tie-ins there. I don't want to call it a CERT program because that's really not the direction we're going in, but we do recognize that we have a capacity gap in the public generally and also within the leadership about risk and response behaviors, actually, in particular. And so developing a network of people who are highly capable and well-trained, both in the public but also in leadership, is a priority for the city. So what that looks like yet is still, a little bit to be decided, and we're starting that kind of planning process right now as a project area. So this is a really exciting initiative.
What have been your biggest obstacles in this new initiative that you're at the helm of?
The biggest obstacle has just been the newness and the short duration of it, and this sort of skepticism that comes along with those two components of it. Again, people are kind of primed for it because we've had these disasters, but at the same time, it's hard for some folks to wrap their mind around, well, what should we do differently? I mean, where is the sort of secret sauce in this, and what does that get us? And so there's a little bit of a sales pitch there that I think is starting to gain some traction. I think there's enough buy-in from leadership within the organization, and the community has really been fired up, particularly the artistic community, which is not in my wheelhouse at all, but it's been really exciting to see these folks get interested in resilience and disasters. So.
Wow, that's nice. That could be a good marketing tool.
Yeah, and I really hope to use them as we do more and more public outreach around resilience as a core principle.
What lessons would you want to share with other communities as far as their programs of resiliency? And if they're not as far along as Boulder, what steps do you think that they could take to get there?
Well, I think the chief lesson that I've learned, this is a personal lesson, of course, and there are many others that flow from this, is that the chief resilience officer position is intended to be in the top tier of city government. Certainly not the city manager, but assistant city manager or deputy mayor, depending on your city structure. In Boulder, there was a decision not to do that for a whole host of reasons that, of course, I wasn't privy to. So I'm actually in comprehensive planning and sustainability, which is the bulk of the function of the city government, which is fine. But when you're talking about a position that's supposed to work across the entire organization, there have been substantial or significant implications to that decision. And it's taken a lot longer to gain some traction and buy-in from other parts of the organization. So I think that would be the biggest lesson, is actually I think that the original model, and we're starting to see that in some of the other CROs around the world, is a good one. The other piece of the Rockefeller model for the CRO is that it's supposed to be an external hire. It's supposed to be a catalytic agent, kind of mess things up and blunder around and change things. And so that's my background. And I think that it's been challenging. I mean, to be totally honest, local government's new to me. It's been very, very challenging. However, I think because of the new coalitions I've had to build, to sort of beg, borrow, steal resources to make something happen, will probably make the program more sustainable in the long run. I mean,
And you
people
have a
have
fresh
buy-in.
lens as
Yeah,
well of
yeah.
looking at problems that the city government probably has been regurgitating
Yeah.
in the same fashion for a long time.
And I think this is true in a lot of governments, but we see this a lot in Boulder is that most of the professional city staff doesn't have a whole lot of interaction with the community. So I come with a very different set of community networks, and I think that has given me some credibility. And the grant funding from Rockefeller allows me to sort of step outside of the organization a little bit and say, just work with the business community at a very different level. It's not as contentious, perhaps, or same thing with the research community at the university. That's where a lot of my background is, so I have those connections, and I think that's starting to bear some fruit, too.
Was Rockefeller Foundation involved in the hire, or was it only the city of Boulder and the whatever, or how did they find you in a sense, or how did you even apply, or who did you even apply to, or was it an appointment?
It was a full open hire. It was a very rigorous process, shockingly so. But it was the city's process. There was I think probably some assistance that went into describing what the job should look like, and then it was up to the city to hire.
Yeah, because you can imagine them trying to hire you and they don't even know what it is and what the questions to ask are, in a sense. I mean, you knew more than them, as you should have, because they needed your insight, but it must have been a curious process.
Definitely. And so in terms of the way I found out, it was actually through a referral. A friend was like, hey, you should think about this. Like I said, I've been doing this work in Asia, and I had sort of been tiring of that because it was a lot of time on a plane, and it seemed a little silly to be building resilience in communities all around the world when we had just gone through this disaster here, and there was so much immediate need. And then I was aware of the Rockefeller program, and that Boulder had been selected, but not that they were hiring. And so it wound up being kind of a long shot. I got thrown into the last pool. And,
What kind of assistance do you think you could have from somebody like FEMA, besides what they've helped you out with in floodplain?
Yeah, so the FEMA relationship changes pretty radically after you've had a disaster, right? So there's a very positive, for the most part, relationship in the mitigation activities. Certainly, it was not, and I'm not saying anything that people don't know. I mean, it was not necessarily 100% great in the recovery period, and I think it was a co-learning process. I think FEMA was treating the event like a Mississippi flood, and it just wasn't. It was also not a flash flood. But I think once some of those things got ironed out, I think we're moving along. But I think there is a role here for a more fine-grained kind of co-learning. I think the city was really shocked by some of the processes, not shocked that they were unaware, but just that it's much more difficult, and particularly when you're in crisis mode, to navigate those programs. So.
The state of Vermont is one of our Resilient Neighbors Network communities, even though it's a state. So it was excellent to see how the peer-to-peer level at the state level and officials from Vermont came to help Boulder with some of their similar flooding situations. And can you comment on the peer-to-peer exchanges that you're doing with Rockefeller and other local officials?
I was just asking the same question. That's great. If these guys are your cohorts, like the whole Rockefeller, the rest of the officers in a similar position in other cities, do you guys communicate? And are you on the same page? Well,
I mean, so it's not by mistake that it's 100 cities that are networked together, and there will be eventually 100 cities. They just open the next round. But yeah, I certainly I connect with my CRO colleagues probably on a weekly basis, one or another. And in fact, I just came from the NRDC Academy down in Denver, and my colleague Jeff from New Orleans was there. And it's just, we share so many similar experiences. We're all dealing with a different context and different politics, but there's sort of the technical assistance, that comes from knowing these people. It's like, have you done this? Do you know anybody who's done something innovative in this space? That's a tremendous resource. But frankly, this is new, and it's a very lonely business in the city. This is true, I think, across the CROs. And so there's a little bit of a therapy component to it, too, just knowing that there's somebody else going through it, and that there's a bunch of them, and that they're sharing the same experiences, the same frustrations. at some level or another, and just being able to call them or write an email or like, hey, how are you dealing with this issue? It's really
They had a declared disaster, but they had damage beyond their local capacity. They call up another one of our RNN communities and say, so what did you do in this situation?
Yeah.
And that they know each other, they have a connection, and they know if they're emergency management person or if they're in stormwater, and they can figure out, they all wear so many hats at the local level.
Yeah, I mean the networks are really the essence of this, and through, it was not through Rockefeller, but it kind of leveraged this investment. The BOCO Strong network in the county next door applied for a grant to the state to build a resilience network. So there's 4 main activities around that grant, but that's really to sort of institutionalize a resilience network in the mountain communities, on the plains communities, leverage resources that are coming in through other channels. It's a tremendous effort. I mean, it's so exciting, right? People are really fired up about this.
Can you say what the 4 initiatives are?
Yeah, so it's a little bit to replicate what we're doing in the city, because of course there's not a lot of money for that to begin with, but it's really focused on the city. So one of the efforts is to constitute the network. What does that actually represent? How do we start convening as a group around some common principles? So that's already underway. Doing a preliminary risk assessment of the county's capabilities and vulnerabilities, and we're about to start that. Standing up a local VOAD, volunteer organizations active in disasters. Boulder did not have one during the event, and that was a huge capacity gap that was missing. And then the 4th one is pilot projects, 4 or 6 pilot projects in the affected communities, to be determined, but through stakeholder engagement.
We've seen in our RNN discussions that communities that haven't been deemed a Rockefeller, haven't received the RNN or aren't getting some of the resiliency dollars, are concerned because they're the community in the event of a disaster where people are going to go to. Like Shenandoah Valley. Everyone, potentially a lot of people in DC, if there's an event, are going to evacuate down there. And how do you prepare? What can that community do? So networks within your own region seem to be a really good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that most obviously, I think, in the housing field. I mean, so even in some of our less prosperous communities in the county, they have a housing affordability crunch too. And so when you lose some of the affordable housing where the most vulnerable live, it just puts a pressure on everything. And so having a more regional strategy for disasters might be something that we could think about. I know that San Francisco is thinking very strongly about that through their chief resilience officer. So we may try and emulate some of their programming.
It really puts a community in jeopardy when they don't have the capacity, people living in that community, to address the emergencies. I mean, if you're living in Aspen, but your emergency manager is all the way up in Glenwood Springs, for them to come through that canyon to get to help.
Right. Chopper them in, I guess. I don't know, but I mean, really, it's a huge vulnerability, and we're just looking at the capacity. I mean, these are, in the future, you can expect more of these events, whether they're prolonged and intense droughts, which are one thing, but wildfires. Having the capacity in the community to deal with these uncertain risks is really what we're looking at, and it has to be skills and knowledge. It's not preventative of any particular disaster because they compound in this environment.
My impression I've only been to the Natural Hazards Conference 2 years, and it's just so inspirational. I just wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, if there's a way to get more applied research out there. Is that happening enough, or could it happen more? Because I don't know, sometimes I think, and this isn't to be a negative, but that people need to see projects done and moving on and becoming, doing.
Yeah, this has been a persistent problem, and the hazards workshop has been instrumental in sort of changing the mindset. But even so, it's a long road to go. Just that research to practice and the barrier. It's about timing. It's about resourcing. It's about kind of making the connection at the beginning. What's the research question and how does it apply to me? And can you do it in the time frame that's meaningful? We're starting to see some changes and some partnerships with CU. In fact, the new Sustainability and Environment School is really oriented towards applied problem solving, and we're trying to lay out a map of what Boulder could look like around a whole host of research questions on renewable energy, but some of the more core resilience type things and just having pathways for engagement that are sort of prescribed and again, don't know what it looks like yet, but it's really exciting. I mean, there's just a real recognition that students need to be coming out of these programs with skills and knowledge and applied work.
Yeah, also that you know the lay of the land of Boulder from the work you've been doing here, and you know the players, you know the city, you know the geography, so that must be incredibly helpful in your position now.
I think it is. I mean, we'll see, that the sustainability of these things is kind of hard to gauge, but I think there is something really valuable in my particular background in this community and my understanding of how research works and where it can fit in, I think is a transformative piece of what's going on, because there's always been some interaction with the university around research questions. Sometimes it's around alcohol or enforcement, but I think this will be a change.
I have one more question. How does your experience in Southeast Asia, do you have tangible examples of how you bring that to your work here in the States?
Yeah, well, so the ACERN program, like I said, was sort of a precursor to 100 Resilient Cities, and so it was really the test bed for some of these concepts of resilience, actually. I mean, it's hard to even remember that even 5 years ago there wasn't one good definition. Now we have a bunch of good definitions. So bringing some of that, but it's a little bit of insight into how to put it. I mean, I think the big takeaway from ACERN was that you need a champion, right? That there has to be somebody mobilizing the resources and aligning programs, and that became the Chief Resilience Officer. In my personal experience with that, I've seen what works in some cities in terms of mobilizing interest around, in that case, around climate change, and the way that they use their social networks in ways that we're not necessarily all that great at. I mean, there's something about how some of these other societies and communities work that we have a lot to learn.
What cities specifically were you focusing on there in Asia?
In Asia, actually, a couple of them have wound up becoming 100 RC cities as well. So it's Da Nang, Vietnam was one of them. There's 10. The ones I was working in primarily were in Indonesia, Semarang, which is now a partner city. Bangkok is a partner city, but that's where a lot of the work was happening.
That is excellent.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time over there.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, a long time ago, but yeah.
It's fun. I mean, one of the things that is pretty exciting when you do work in the developing world is that they just don't, for the most part, have a lot of capacity. So for every unit of effort, you see it goes a long way, and that's not necessarily the case in the United States. We make a lot of decisions, rationally or otherwise, that put us at greater risk. And in a lot of those communities, they may make those same choices ultimately, but they don't often have the choice. So that's kind of an interesting philosophical thing, and I really do like doing that kind of work for that value, but it's nice to be working in my own community for change.
Nice.